Okay, now these remarks are meant to be an introduction to the subject as a whole. And what I think we observe in the meaning of psychotherapy that I'm suggesting is peculiar to the 20th century, in the sense that there's no doubt at all that there's extensive literature and a great deal of knowledge about the influence that people can have on one another. For example, the great book that Pierre Janet published on healing, 1906, 1908, was a product of a great deal that had been learned in the 19th century. But what was striking about that book, in contrast to psychotherapy as it has developed, in part anyway, was the authority of the doctor. And that up until the 20th century, the distinction between, for example, faith healing and psychotherapy is very difficult to make. But when the work is taken up scientifically, in the sense of not depending upon a preordained set of notions or authorities of the physician, I think psychotherapy, as I understand it, begins. And the open exploration of the possibilities of human life, the innumerable, or almost innumerable, technical developments that accompany the effort to explore one person with another, all these comprise, of course, what is the present-day picture, one of extraordinary diversity and confusion. And whether out of that will come any kind of consolidating trends and clear medical indication, the lies is still very much up in the air, although I hope to point out what I think are the directions of that sort. To me, the crucial event in this, many others pick different events. To me, the crucial event in the development of modern psychotherapy is that the set of constructs that Freud provided, to provide, in my opinion, for the first time, a set of ideas which could allow one to talk systematically about a great many of the different elements that went back and forth between human beings: sexuality, aggressiveness, distortions. To my knowledge, before the Freudian concepts, it was not possible to really bring into the concourse of human interchanges anything like a systematic understanding. This, what should you say, secularization, this organization, this almost normalization of the material that passed between people is the starting point, it seems to me, for psychotherapy. And that is the reason I think that psychoanalysis remains the standard against which all subsequent efforts to systematize, indeed all subsequent efforts to develop in different directions, this work has been judged. Now, there are three, I think, characteristics of Freud's mind which set inevitable limits on what he was able to do. First of all, his theoretical and explanatory interests. And second of all, his authoritative position. And finally, his identification as a neurologist and biologist. First of all, the fact that his interest was primarily investigative and theoretical put the explanatory mode and the verbal theoretical mode, put a mark on psychotherapy in those terms, which restricted much of what could pass in psychotherapy to that explanatory and theoretical, within that explanatory and theoretical mode. I don't mean simply the ideas and their restrictions, but the fact that his interest was investigatory and explanatory. That put a very heavy intellectual cast, inevitably, on the relationships between the patient and the therapist. The second thing was that, perhaps in keeping with his Victorian time, or perhaps his individual persona, or whatever, his was an authoritative position. And that, too, I think, is fed into by the medical attitudes in which the tradition, of course, is that the doctor prescribes and knows best. And this authoritative and sometimes authoritarian cast in Freud's mind inevitably impressed itself not only on his relationship with his patients, but also on the whole movement, and on the students of psychoanalysis, and on the students of the students, and the patients of the students. So that this, in turn, this authoritarian mode, again, restricted the extent to which psychotherapy could be developed. And in close keeping with that, his identity is the third point. Is Freud's identification as a biologist, and specifically a neurologist, meant that he was restricted in part to conceiving of the mind on the model of the brain. And although this was an extremely useful way to begin to approach mind as a phenomenon, it, as I say, inevitably cast very serious restrictions on the kind of phenomena that could be recognized about mind. And when I talk next time, I'm going to talk about the nature of mind and the way in which the difficulties that the bodily constructs from psychoanalysis has in encompassing the range of intellectual, mental phenomena that one encounters as a psychotherapist. Furthermore, Freud's thinking about the brain, his identification as a neurologist, his interest in writing books, for example, about childhood aphasia and all kinds of things, meant that to some extent he saw the mind as like the brain, and therefore as something like the brain that you can pick up and study and hold and control, and not as indeed what the mind is, which is a phenomenon of equality with the examining mind, which cannot be held or shaped or controlled in this fashion without radically distorting the character of the mind in question. So that this inevitably set a very serious set of restrictions on his capacity to understand psychotherapy as a mental phenomenon, as a psychic phenomenon, as a psychotherapy. Now these developments, this breakdown of a somewhat rationalistic, authoritarian, sometimes bodily-oriented system, I think can be seen in more general terms. These comparisons are perhaps a little strained, but let me make them anyway. That is, it has often been remarked that Freud is a 19th century figure, and that when one gets into the major moving figures of 20th century thought, there is gradually occurring a recasting of the habits of thought, which are embodied, for example, some say, in the breakdown of the classical physics into the system of relativity and indeterminacy, things of this kind, which are sometimes compared with the kind of mentalization of phenomena I'm talking about. Furthermore, in art, to me, the change is the most dramatic one, in that one goes from at least a preponderant concern with external reality as a phenomenon that the artist studies and masters, to a concentration on the act of making art as itself the subject of art. So that the boundary line between the subject and the object become increasingly difficult to demarcate sharply. I think, again, taking a very broad sweep at it, I think that in the influence of certainly the later Wittgenstein, where the whole concept of knowing is thrown out, if not thrown out, at least put to one side as a central mental concern, and something like searching or exploring take the place of knowing as a central philosophical concern. And then in the work of Heidegger, where the ancient problem of being becomes the central focus of Heidegger's work, and indeed human being, so that the meaning of human being comes into philosophy and by extension into psychiatry in a way that I think casts a considerable fresh light on even our psychiatric concerns. What these developments have in common, in my conception of it, is that one loses the predominant Western conception of an external reality, which is examined by an hopefully objective mind. That no longer is the world seen as something separate from the mind, but that the nature of art and science, for example, are not opposite in that science is objective and art is subjective, but that both have in common a working of the mind in the world, or what has sometimes been called a making real. So that what we conceive of a reality is not a fixed external reality that one examines from a sort of fixed platform, but is indeed the result of a kind of conspiracy of mind and world. And I don't mean to say that I see anywhere near the depths of that, but and sometimes the forms of it puzzle me very much, but the puzzle is itself perhaps the point to make. For example, as many of you know, I'm sure that relatively late in Einstein's life, he reversed himself sharply on the view of scientific epistemology he had. He originally had the idea very much of the Ernst Mach empiricist version, that the scientist collected facts, and out of those facts he formed his theory. And in the latter part of Einstein's life, he set himself deliberately against that point of view, and said that that was not the way in which physics, at least, was done. That physics depended first upon a set of conceptions, and out of the conceptions came the equations, which the facts were found either to match or not to match. And there's a famous passage in which he says that the equations of relativity could never have been deduced from what was known of the external world. And he was asked at one point what he thought the central mystery of his scientific life had been, and he said it was what it has always been, the fact that the mind and nature are able to, so to speak, understand one another. That there is a match between mind and nature, at least in part. That seemed to him an extraordinary curiosity, a peculiarity, that mind could find itself in this kind of understanding relationship with nature. I mention that not because that fits so directly with what I'm saying, but because the traditional Cartesian view of the relationship between mind and nature is obviously not being spoken about in those conceptualizations. Now, that may seem to you needlessly abstract, and so let me try to bring it as much as I can into relationship, and I think one can very easily bring it in relationship to psychotherapy, and rephrase it in relation to psychotherapy. I think what we are observing is a movement away from psychotherapy as a system of observation of an external reality by an ego more or less able to master or understand that external reality, and an ego which itself, the therapeutic process, is supposed to inform or correct or strengthen in its exploration and mastery of external or internal reality. I think we're moving away from that to, again, a conception of work in which, still poorly defined, in which this separation of observer and observed, or ego and external reality, is no longer accepted at all. And in keeping with that, we are moving, in my opinion, actually I would move us, to what extent I have, influence I have, away from a conception, again, of mind as contained in a sort of cranial container, mind as contained a kind of into which one can reach in order to find out things about it. And still, I hope to interest you in the notion of mind as a sort of substance capable of very radical movement outside that cranial fold, and capable also of being vulnerable, attacking and distorting, a kind of substance, if you like, rather than a set of mental attributes which are contained within this physicalistic metaphor of the brain. Now this somewhat different view of mind, of course, is by no means entirely new, in the sense that all throughout Freud, his bounding mind kept escaping the categories that he put up himself, and the view of psychotherapy, which has become so dominant in most of our educational situations, that is, of training an ego or helping an ego to master external reality, is, of course, not wholly his either. And indeed, this one of the great puzzles of theoretical psychoanalysis is what energy, is how you conceptualize the ego's energy to undertake this task. Because it looked, in most of the early formulations at least, like all the energy that was present in the id, or in the unconscious. And even the various transformations of the concept of the unconscious or the id never quite were able to come to grips with the issue of where, if there was this outside or inside and an ego master it, where this ego got its energy. And So he himself sometimes sounded as if it was an educational process. At other times, of course, you get a very strong feeling from Freud that the ego was relatively helpless. That any effort which was directed at it was at best a losing effort. And that the great forces of the mind lay outside this executive apparatus. But I don't think there's any doubt that there has been coming into our world, and I think needs to come in more and more, a radically revised conception of mind in which the psychotherapeutic process is not dependent upon this sharply separated observing ego and external and internal reality forces. Now, whatever one thinks about mind, however one conceptualizes this stuff we deal with, psyche, that we deal with in this process of psychotherapy, I don't think anybody questions the intimate relationship of mind and language. And I think we can test out the intimacy of that relationship by asking ourselves what some of the prevailing understandings of mind have meant in terms of what psychotherapeutic language was used. In other words, we can find out a good deal about what the prevailing prejudices as to the nature of mind by watching the kind of language that people have used in psychotherapy. When I was a first-year resident in 1954, I had a very vivid memory of being told by one of my first and one of my two most influential teachers, Ives Hendrick, that when he had come into psychiatry and psychoanalysis in the late 20s and early 30s of the century, he said the job was, as the teacher's job then, was to get the psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists to shut up and listen. And that, and then in contrast, that when we came in the early 50s, this lesson that psychoanalysis had taught had been learned so completely, so overwhelmingly, that Hendrick told us very early in his supervision of us that the job had completely transformed itself, and now the job was to get the doctors talking again. And that made a lot of sense, but it was a long time before I understood what the historical meaning of that was. And I could now, I think, put with some clarity in terms of the language of the schools what had happened. That is, what had happened was that the methods of objective descriptive psychiatry, that is, the methods of the psychological examination, with its emphasis on questions and orders above all, that method of questions and orders had dominated world psychiatry, still dominates world psychiatry for that matter, but had overwhelmingly dominated things up until the 20s or the 30s, at which point, particularly in the United States, the method of associations, the method of psychoanalysis, began to make itself felt. And the reason, of course, as we all know so well, the reason that the doctors were then silenced, so to speak, was that Freud had convinced a great part of the profession that the method of questions would simply not elicit information of significance. Now, what that meant in terms of the theory of mind was that before the psychoanalytic revolution, the mind had been seen as essentially, I think, like a container into which one reached by means of questions to draw out the information from the cooperative patient, but perhaps from any patient, by testings and questions and orders, a series of data which allowed one to illuminate mind. Let me emphasize that really, because I want to talk, as these lectures go on, specifically about how one talks. I mean, what you say. I mean, literally, I want to talk about grammar and syntax. And here, the principal tools were literally imperatives and interrogatives, questions and orders. And if you think back on your own medical experience of how you elicited information from patients, it really was by those things. You told them what to do and watched for the result, that testing procedures, or you simply asked them. And I don't think that most of us, as we undertook that, quite realized the extent of neurological sophistication that we demanded when we used those methods. For example, the internuntial complexity of a question is easily forgotten. It depends upon your hearing my question, understanding it, accepting it, asking it of yourself, getting the answer back from within yourself, translating it into some language that can be understood, and then giving it back to me. An immense neurological series of events, and requiring, of course, at each point, various links and cooperation being intact for that answer to have much relationship to that question. Well, those were the reasons, part of the reasons, that, of course, Freud abandoned the question as the central tool, the central grammatical tool for his new method. And again, see how his new method depended upon a revised view of mind. Mind was no longer a container in which the relevant information was, so to speak, on the top to be taken off by questions and orders. But the mind was now a container with subcontainers. And these subcontainers had different levels of accessibility, and some could not, for example, be reached by means of the method of questions. And as we all know, when he first started out, he tried to get to those other levels of mind by hypnotic methods. And he found out what we know better now, even better now, that of course the method of hypnosis is better for putting things in than it is for getting things out. It's a brilliant way to put ideas into people's minds, as Charcot had demonstrated, but it isn't such a reliable way to get things out. Because too often, as we know, the hypnotized subject finds out what answer the hypnotist wants and secures that. And then the next method he used was, of course, the method of pressing, a very typical concretistic phase in the methodology that he then really tried to press out the thoughts from his patient's mind. And then he gradually gave that up, and assumed a very passive, listening, silent, not entirely silent, somewhat more silent posture, in which, by providing a screen and a stretch of time, these curious phenomena of mind would spontaneously, or if not spontaneously, at least under the aegis of this kind of listening pressure, divulge the contents that were more deeply hidden in these various levels of subcontainers. As you know, too, that this was an extension of not of Freud's own original thinking, but essentially of Charcot's thinking. You remember when Charcot had made his great psychological formula for hysteria, it rested on what was the formula that replaced the demonological and uterine theories of hysteria by a concept of containers. There was the condition seconde and the primary condition, the higher level container and the lower level container. And the idées could go into the lower level containers, and there was a semi-permeable membrane between the two, and during sleep and at hypnoid moments or under hypnosis, the stuff from the lower level would penetrate up into the upper level and appear as idée fixe in dreams or as symptoms. And that was the brilliant stroke with which he essentially began modern dynamic psychiatry. You know, Freud was his student, knew about those things from him. And so this second, somewhat more sophisticated view of mind was one in which there was a system of subcontainers with different degrees of penetrability. Now, one of the most fascinating things in my mind about this development was that almost at the same time that Freud began to sophisticate the concept of subcontainers, and above all, began to persuade his followers and others that the conventional methods of penetration, the question and the orders, were not going to get at certain kinds of critical things. At the same time that he made one of these subcontainers particularly inaccessible, he discovered something about mind that was paradoxically the opposite. What he discovered almost at the same time was that this subcontainer thing, so difficult to penetrate except by the method of association, also had the property of reaching out to the therapist and undertaking a relationship. Furthermore, when it reached out in the transferences, it not only responded to the real person of the therapist, but it also responded to various imaginary characteristics of the therapist. And as we have learned later, particularly in the most distinguished work of Searles, we have learned that not only does the this mental stuff that is supposed to be in this inaccessible compartment reach out, but we also know it affects the therapist and even distorts the therapist into behaving in certain ways in keeping with its particular structure. So note the interesting paradox. At the very moment that Freud emphasized the inaccessibility of the subcontainer, at that same moment he discovered that not only was it not inaccessible, it came right out. And it could be seen. Notice that although it was unconscious in the sense of being difficult to reach, in another sense it wasn't unconscious at all. Because when the patient saw the therapist in the model of his unconscious needs, he was actually seeing something that was unconscious. It was still unconscious in the sense he didn't know it was his. He didn't know it was his, but in fact he was conscious. He was seeing, literally looking at sometimes, the products of his unconscious. Now I'm saying these things, we'll talk more about this as we go into therapeutic language, but I want you to think about it in terms of this curious thing, mind. Because here mind was not only hidden in this container, but also capable of coming out of that container. And not only coming out of that container, distorting that container, and not only distorting that container, but being seen by the person who was the producer of that material on the person of the therapist, and not being recognized. A case of extraordinary absent-mindedness, you might say, that the mind was unable to recognize itself when it reappeared in this, quote, unconscious form. Well, so that in keeping with this changing conception of mind, keep to my main point, in keeping with this changing conception of mind, there was a changing conception of language. That is, language moved from questions and orders over into silence. But notice the order never left psychoanalysis. Because the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis is an order. Say whatever comes to mind. So that the authoritarian position remained embedded in psychoanalysis, and as I said earlier, served to restrict to some extent its understanding of psychotherapy. So then we have a system in which the old methods are dishonored by their inability to get at the compartments. And on the other hand, the new method of silence has to lay down its arms for those numerous situations in which the method of association does not produce the kind of material that makes medical work effective. And the reason I think that my teacher said, we have to get you talking again, was that neither the method of questions nor the method of associations worked. They worked sometimes, they worked occasionally, but they didn't work well enough. And the trouble, and this was one of the impetuses to my own efforts, the trouble with my teacher saying that was that although he was right, that the method of questions didn't work well enough and the method of associations in many circumstances was helpless, he didn't tell us how we should talk. And these things I'm going to keep spouting at you over the next 6 or 8 months are my answer, my effort to answer that question of how you can talk. In keeping with that, to try to present a somewhat different view of Freud hypothesized that significant mental events were stored. The teaching then was that the method of questions was essentially restricted to the superficial level of the mind. There was still another difficulty, however, and that was that the method of questions and the method of orders, and to some extent also the method of associations, because implicit in the method of associations was this essentially imperative note, say whatever comes to mind. That these methods, because of their didactic and somewhat coercive quality, were quickly found to set up countercurrents. And by countercurrents I mean that instead of securing the kind of cooperation and readiness to reveal themselves, the very coercive and inquiring, inquisitive, probing nature of these things set up countercurrents to their own success. And notice again, it's the curious quality of mind that you wouldn't predict from a physicalistic metaphor about mind. It was capable of this, of producing these very contrary attitudes on the part of the respondent when it was not treated right, you might say, because of the inquisitive or coercive nature of the question or of the associative method. However, these objections to the traditional methods have not really gained very much force even today. I think because of what I mentioned in some detail earlier. That is because there remains a view of mind which is of a container thing, in which one container examines another container, and that there is a fixed external reality which these objective containers are able to record and explore. And therefore, if one could form a good relationship between one rational container, or parts of it, reasonable parts of one container, reasonable parts of another, these reasonable or ego parts would be able to make readings on this objective reality and improve their capacities to manage things, and you would have success. Because that's been the predominant view of mind. The various difficulties that view has when you put it into action through its usual tools of associative and coercive and interpretive language, those difficulties that everybody's been sort of aware of and made trouble with, and are represented by my teacher saying, "We've got to get you talking again, but I don't know what to tell you to say." Those objections have been nullified to some extent, or put to one side. I think the objections are becoming so overwhelming that we may be getting to that point where, as Kuhn says in these books about paradigmatic science, we may get to the point where people just have to throw out this old paradigm of the mind and begin to think about another one that is, I think, less based, as you'll see, less based on a neurological or physicalistic metaphor. There's another, however. I want to close by a little exposition of the idea that there's still another property of mind which is even more fundamental to our beginning to think about psychotherapy. And remember I said that when Freud introduced his notions of subcontainers, Charcot's notion of subcontainers, he at the same time discovered another property of mind. Not only was it inaccessible in part, but also it had an extraordinary capacity to be aggressive, or to come out, and to reach out, in fact, and distort the person with which it was present. So he discovered that property of mind, and of course that became, isn't it interesting, that curious property which he would not have predicted from a physicalistic model, that property became the center of the whole treatment, didn't it? Transference interpretation, transference neurosis, etc., etc. However, and we'll come back to that matter all through these remarks, but even before one gets to that curious property of mind, you get to another which is perhaps even more extraordinary, in my opinion. And that is the fact that the mind can be absent. And I never have failed to get a laugh out of people when I'm making related remarks, by reminding them of the most incontestable evidence that you ever could possibly have of the capacity of the mind to absent itself, by simply reminding people that the only way they can stand to listen to this kind of thing like a lecture is because most of the time, 80-90% of the time, you can send your mind away. And I mean that literally. I don't want our predominant physicalistic attitudes to let us escape knowing the fact that we can literally send it away, and you can send it anywhere you want, anywhere within the limits of your imaginative freedom, time and space. And I don't know what it means, but it tickles me to think that what might even be thought of in some respects as a decisive demonstration that mind is not like the physical world is that if Einstein is right about the physical world being restricted to the speed of light, here we have something that can go faster than the speed of light. You can literally go anywhere, anytime you want, as fast as your imagination can carry it. Now, so here we have a property of mind to be absent. Furthermore, this is not a trivial property of mind, because sometimes not only can your mind be absent, but you can lose your mind. And if you think what I'm saying is trivial, you should remember that you can lose your mind and never get it back. And this hospital contains people who have in various degrees lost their mind and may never get it back. So this is something that it's not a game we play the way you play by thinking about something more interesting or more important while I'm talking. This is an event which in certain degrees constitutes a human tragedy of the greatest proportions. I emphasize that here because it seems to me that there isn't a better beginning point for thinking not only about mind, but also about psychotherapy than this question of the absent mind. Because it would seem to me obvious that unless we can get the patient's mind in the room with us, not very much is likely to happen. And so we could almost put it down as a sort of a first principle that psychotherapeutic language should have in it the capacity to find the other person. Now, to find the other person, and also I'll talk about 2 or 3 times from now, to find not only the person, but also to find a workable distance from the other person's mind at which to carry on the activity. Because not only can the mind move away from us, it can also move toward us. It can invade us, it can attack us, it can get all over us. You won't know that sensation when you're with some people who just simply will not get off you. And that isn't a way you, in my opinion, you can easily work. You have to find a working distance. So this language I want to talk about should not only be able to locate the person, or if they're not in the room, to go find them where they are, but also be able to act in such a way as to establish a working distance between my mind and your mind. I emphasize that point that the whole work may be carried on outside the room. We don't necessarily have to bring the patient in here, but if we don't bring the patient in, we have to go where they go. I had an example of this the other day. I was seeing a businessman who was in love with his secretary. And he was looking particularly, in this particular hour, he was looking particularly absent and distracted. Absent, distracted. And he wasn't in the room with me. I could have asked him about it. I could have waited. He might come back, and there's many occasions when those things will work. And many occasions, though, when if you do ask or you wait, nothing happens, or the person goes further away. Hence the need for language that goes in search, you might say, of the other person. Anyway, I happen to know that his secretary was on vacation, and that day it was raining. It often has been lately. It was raining, and so I said to him something like, I hope the weather is better in Jamaica. My point was, if he was in Jamaica at that moment with his secretary, that we could be there together. And I mean it quite literally. And it was interesting because when I said that, he was startled. And it was as if I had shown up unexpectedly beside him. And indeed, I think that's mentally what happened. That he was thinking about his secretary in Jamaica, and I was able to get there and be with him at that time. And indeed, the rest of the time we spent talking about his secretary and what it was like to be in Jamaica and what the difficulties were going to be when the two of them mentally came back from this thing. Now, I think that was suggestively in a way, a genuine locating of this man in his preoccupation. And that the language, I hope the weather is better in Jamaica, had various elements that hopefully you'll dissect over the course of this, which allowed it to represent, so to speak, my presence beside him and the secretary in Jamaica. So the language we then are looking for is language which allows us to move, to be accepted, to be specifically located in some particular mental space, you like, which in turn is also an actual real space.
Are you ready for a question?
Almost ready. Well, sure.
One thing you said that only perplexed me was that there are things about what happens to the unconscious material in analysis that wouldn't be predicted by a physicalist analogy. And in particular, I think you were referring to resistance and to projection. Well, those are two things that I think would have been most elegantly predicted by the physicalist analogy in this way. If you apply, in physics, if you apply a potential, the point of which is to draw something fluid through a resistance, you encounter resistance, which is known by the energy that it wastes, and you also set up another kind of resistance. And indeed, in classical physics, the description of resistance has two vectorial components. One is, it's called impedance, and it has two vectorial components. One is strict resistance, and the other is inductance. What you could do with unconscious content, which is pulled into motion by the expectations of the therapist, is number one, to encounter resistance coming out, and number two, to induce these ideas, these preformed notions that constitute the projective content of the transference.
That's breaking. I don't know enough about electrical theory to follow you, but notice what you've just done to us. You've done something that Freud didn't do. It might have been better if he had, or you might want to do it nowadays. But you see, he didn't talk about electrical properties. You're making a translation. The way by which he understood this projection was what? In terms of instinct. Now, you're suggesting that there are two electrical systems, two minds which act like electrical systems which could do this. I don't question that you're right about it. But that's and might be other physicalistic systems which would also do this. But that is not the system that he used. And he used a system in which there was an outgoing property of mind called instinct. Right? And I think that illuminates the difficulties very sharply, because if you think about the extraordinary things your electrical system or the mental system can do in reaching out, you can see right away the concept of instincts isn't going to be able to do that. The instincts is a relatively crude system of reaching out, isn't it? And it doesn't contain, for example, a concept of distortion or projection. Basically, it's really a concept of action. And so I think that's the one he had, but it's not the one that I think will take into account these mental properties. And I don't mean to suggest that you couldn't think of more sophisticated physicalistic systems that would represent mind.
It was fluid dynamics on the level of development of Pascal that he was dealing with, not electrical theory that hadn't yet been passed to him. The second point is that going along with more modern physics, being able to accommodate one of the more peculiar features of mind we mentioned, its ability to travel instantaneously to anywhere. If you look at Lorentz transformations that describe special relativistic dynamics in modern physics, as of 1910 or thereabouts, those equations allow that if something were to be moving at the speed of light, in this case mind, it would be anywhere at any time. All distances would be contracted to nothing. And the person whose mind was moving at the speed of light, for example, could mentally be anywhere at all times, at no cost.
Well, you're losing me there. I thought that, you sound like you know much more about it than I do, but I thought that nothing could go faster than the speed of light.
Oh, but if you allow an object to be moving, for the sake of argument, at the speed of light, and then plug that object in at this velocity into Lorentz transformations, you get that its ability to cover distance is infinite. And the time that it takes to get anywhere is infinitesimal. It's just
I probably know my depths in talking about that matter at all, but I thought that I didn't think that instantaneous movement was really a modern physical conception. Maybe something.
They say that because of that, then you can't do it. Because an object would have to be anywhere at all times, infinitely massive and so forth. It can't exist, so by reductio ad absurdum.
But you're saying that mind can do that? I'm having real problems also with a model that doesn't. I'm not conversant in modern physics or psychotherapy, but I'm having problems with a model that apparently doesn't follow the same physical laws as everything else has to.
Well, maybe it does according to your colleague, but they certainly don't follow what we generally thought to be a biological principle.
The difference is that an object that could do that would have to be massless to begin with. And if mind is massless, then it can do that.
Maybe that's the way.
Isn't this to a certain extent a reification of something that's more metaphorical than anything else?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, it depends.
we seem to be arguing
But
about
it's
whether the physics fits the mind, and Brock, who was Freud's instructor in physiology, was a student of Helmholtz. Helmholtz was a physicist. If Freud had wanted a physical electrical model, I guess he could have constructed one. He used the fluid dynamics model. But,
There are a number of yogis who would agree 100% with what you said. You tell you that they've done it.
Well, I wanted, maybe I've obscured my own point by bringing in this. Did you make me think I have? And I want to keep the discussion as much as I can to the actual properties of mind that you observe in psychotherapy, like the absence of memory, losing.
I mean, I think an important clarification, if I understand what you're saying, is that in fact, that the mind, the properties of mind that you are talking about in some in some real sense, what you're talking about is a metaphor. That you are talking about the properties of mind that we all can understand, the ability to influence another person to get outside of ourselves. But in fact, in a real sense, or in some sense, not real or not real, it's not the mind that gets outside us. It's what the mind does to us, which is communicated to the person. If in fact the patient and the doctor, or the two people, were sitting in different rooms, the interaction wouldn't be the same. It's the totality of what we do, how our mind influences our body that affects the other person. Body language and all of that. And so when we use the metaphor of the mind, this thing in this deep box, which we are not even aware of, getting outside of the box, not only in our head but in the other patient's head, that's a very, I think, artful but unambiguous metaphor.
But
Is that?
Well, I agree with you, and I didn't mean it any more than a metaphor. I want to call attention to the properties.
Oh, I
Make those properties shake a little bit our conception of mind so far,
I
and
agree.
not expect to arrive at a fresh conception.
But
I found it's awfully hard to get people thinking about these other properties of mind while they remain wedded to this earlier mind.
But it then becomes fruitless to talk about to get back into a strictly particle theory that I can figure out a system that would do the same thing. So in fact,
well, but I don't think that is fruitless. I don't agree with you. I think it's extremely interesting to think about systems in which these properties are also manifest. And that's why Freud's model was so useful, because he thought about systems in which they were manifest. This system of instincts, the hydraulic system, which served for a long time very well and did encompass the clinical observations that were available. Some of them, anyway. I don't think we're ever going to get along without some.
Well, it's true. We may think in terms of analogy, but
Well, but that's the way we think. That's the way our minds work.
That's the way we experience ourselves.
Yeah.
The idea of a container.
Well,
but I mean,
what you're saying metaphorically, I'm having trouble distinguishing when you're being metaphorical and when you're being literal. Because there are some people who would say that what you're saying can be true literally.
Well, I wouldn't make any distinction between literal and metaphor. I think human thought is inevitable metaphor. I mean, all we have is these things that we bring to bear on our experience, right? And they're like similes, metaphors, figures, metonymies. That's all we've got. I mean, again, you see, aren't you suggesting that there's sort of a reality out there, right?
Yes,
The literal reality, right?
Right.
Well, I'm trying to shake that idea. That all one finds when one goes out there is the shadows of one's metaphors.
Mm.
And that
aren't you slipping toward a solipsism almost in that form?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, what did Einstein mean when he said you could never have deduced relativity equations from any known facts? The equations were far too intricate. They came out of the conception.
I mean, there are lots of things that Einstein said that people didn't agree with. I mean, Einstein didn't agree with Heisenberg.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. It's shared by a lot of people. It's shared by Gerald Holton, for example, a distinguished philosopher of science. But I don't know what the truth is. It seems to me that this sort of making real, this conspiracy of metaphor and literal, if you like, is the nature of science and art both. I'm not that obviously is the only way to look at it. I'm telling you mine.
An interesting correlate here. When Rogers asked, "Is there any agreement about this?" It's the focus is on the establishment of a reality, be it a metaphorical one or a literal one, or an internal, external one, on a sharing, on an agreement that the way we understand reality is through some agreement, and that swinging from there to language, that our way that human beings need to, that when you get into faster than the speed of light and all sorts of ideas, that the reason that structures are important is because you can't have an affect without a detail, and you can't have a detail without I would posit that you can't have a detail without an affect. That our way is through, this is a little unstructured, so I'll try to structure it more, is through our language. So that's the way we communicate with each other. That's the way that we agree or disagree with each other. That is the way, therefore, that we define our realities, however we define them. That importance, that is sort of the focus then becomes the importance of the communication.
Let me see if I can bring that into relation to what I said earlier about the discovery of transference and what a job it did on objectivity, because it was the discovery not only of transference but of countertransference. And when the contents of the container could not only be perceived as different than the object felt it was, but could also come out and distort and change that external object, then there was literally no objective place from which the system could be independently examined. Because even if you said, well, I'll bring in a third observer, that third observer also might become the object of the energies emerging from the box and be in turn distorted.
So if you want an analogy, you would Heisenberg, that every observer distorts the measurement sufficiently so that you can only reach a certain degree of...
A certain degree of accuracy, right. And that was implicit in what I said about the relativity and determinacy, and also implicit in the Wittgensteinian notion that you give up knowing and have to settle for a kind of searching or approximation. Right.
But Heisenberg escapes that radical subjectivity through some kind of physical therapy.
Well, yes, they discover means by which you can make measurements, but those measurements are always within certain limits, approximations.
Yeah.
In other words, you want to know one thing, you can't know another. Or the only way, or what's I think even more relevant to our concern in psychiatry is if you really want to know very accurately, the result of it is you distort the system. The measurement is so heavy on the system, you get a measurement, but it's a measurement that is the distortion measurement of your instrument.
Which you can't know.
Which you can't know.
estimate the distortion, you know.
And those of you who have tried to apply, for example, a DSM interview to a patient, a heavy instrument like that, know that you can get very accurate information, but you don't know to what extent you've distorted your system. Or, you get in your supervisory discussions, you'll no doubt have endless quarrels within yourself or with your supervisors, silently or publicly, as to whether the processes observed are countertransference or transference. And we don't have any systematic means for the resolution of that. And that's why the debate goes on. And one of the things I hope to get to as these discussions go on is a way that I think I can see by which those distortions are reduced. Of course, the way they're usually supposed to be reduced is that you go get yourself analyzed, right? And that is a useful thing often to do. But in actual working principle, you don't know whether that has had a successful impact on the particular interview. And I want to suggest some means by which that can be factored out a little bit, of course, without, again, dictating that they're finally precise.
I want to consider the value of some of the consensually shared models or reified metaphors by which most people live their lives, like that idea of the container. Most people experience themselves as being contained within their body. Their mental contents is contained within their mind. And in working with somebody, working with a patient, and also in thinking about that patient,
See, notice that's how he slipped over saying within the body to within the mind, as if the mind had a withinness.
right. Well, I think we experience a withinness to our mind.
Your
It's
the expression is you're self-contained. Notice that one of the words, you're self-contained.
Right. I mean, just the metaphors we use, it slipped my mind. It went out of my mind.
Yeah.
I'm out of my mind.
Right.
You know, you talked about patients here who've lost their mind,
Lost them.
and
that doesn't fit so easily with a container.
right. But your follow-up to that was that they're contained here. Those patients are contained here. We take over the containing function
Right.
because their container has disintegrated or gone out to lunch for a while.
Or
And
at least it's become so elastic that, for example, part of the mind can talk to the person from a corner of the room with their foot or something like that. So they've literally lost portions of it.
right, they're
Literally lost.
their container has become.
Is that a metaphor?
They haven't lost it, though.
Oh.
And they still have them, they're just over in the corner down
Uh-huh.
the foot.
No, they don't have
Well,
them. Their experience is very alien. They don't have them. If you mean anything by having or integrating, they don't have them. So, and indeed, it can go further away so they can't even get it back.
So their container has become fragmented or leaky. Their contents have lost and gone out there somewhere. And in
But is
therapy,
the mind, notice how you're equivocating. Is the mind the container or in the container?
it's both. There's the mental contents which are being contained within the thinking apparatus, and that thinking apparatus works over the contents. And in therapy, the therapist is taking over that container function as the patient produces his verbal material, which might be construed as contents. The therapist.
But does that fit with my example of where did it contain my delinquent patient's Jamaican travels? I went with him. It's different. I was a companion. I mean, I agree that the containing phenomenon does occur in therapy. But this seemed to be different.
Well,
This seemed to me I moved along. No?
You moved along, but there was an aspect of containing in that here he was on his travel. I'm not so sure that he was aware of being on his travel, and that's why he wasn't with you. And that by your pointing that out to him, not only were you with him,
I
but
didn't point it out.
point it out.
I wasn't. I was very careful not to. For one thing, if I pointed it out, he might have felt delinquent.
What did the guy
There was
say?
Withdrawn further from me.
Uh-huh.
He might have acted as if he was in the room to be a good boy for me. But he would have left his heart behind, right? And concealed me even more. Because if I asked him, he might surely have felt that good patients don't go with their secretaries to Jamaica. That's called acting out.
But certainly, just in the fact that you said, how's the weather in Jamaica, you're acknowledging the fact that that's where he is. And there's
No, careful. I said,
There's
I
awareness.
hope the weather's better in Jamaica.
but implicit in there is that your knowledge that that's where he is.
No. My statement was neutral. I didn't say, notice I didn't say he shouldn't be there. I didn't even say he was there. I didn't even mention that she was there. I just hoped the weather was better in Jamaica.
What did he say?
See, I'm innocent. And I mean, that innocence is important. I know.
What did he say? What did he say to that?
He looked startled, and at first didn't say very much. And then he said he hopes it was too.
But
Innocent, but not
implicit in
naive.
the
And
idea.
so I thought when he hoped it was too, we were together. We both hoped the weather was better in Jamaica. Now, that's the beginning of a coming together, right? Literally or figuratively.
Dr. Havens, do you want to see a patient? Now is your time.
15 minutes?
I have one that's waiting for me. That's very out of his mind and would produce a lot of interest.
Waiting right now.
Came in and I received a call that he was waiting. I'd like to bring him over and see what we can do.
Insane.
Yeah, I know, very well.
Performancing.
I will.
That's interesting. You only, what do they say, you only go by this way once?
You know, can I ask you a question? About the choice of the word, speaking of language, the choice of the word mind, which is a fine one. It seems like that people have traditionally separated mind, or in my heart of hearts, or what did you have in mind, or what's in your gut, and have located certain, functions in various parts.